Okay, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Sinead Gleeson to the Limerick Literary Festival in honour of Kate O'Brien. Sinead is a writer, broadcaster, anthologist, editor, essayist and poet. Her beautiful poem, At Kinloch Lighthouse, published in the anthology Washing Windows, Irish Women Write Poetry, says so much about her, her own mixed genre, innovative writing and her support of other writers, the ending in particular. The future is never a single beam, nor a straight, unwavering line. You are your own lighthouse. Out on the dark waves, you send up a flare. So you're very, very welcome, Sinead. It's lovely to have you here, even in these strange circumstances where we're not actually side by side, and I can't ask you to sign my books at the end. Anyway.
I wish we were in the same place. I really do, Vivienne. It's such a shame, but it's lovely to have this conversation regardless.
Sinead's your latest book is the wonderful anthology, The Art of the Glimpse, 100 short stories, was published by Head of Zeus. I want to begin, though, with Constellations, this book. This is Sinead's, I'm just going to hold it for a minute. This is Sinead's brilliant book, Reflections from Life. It's a very, very personal book of essays, published by Picador in 2019. How did this book come about, Sinead?
Do you know, it's a funny one. I think people, when they ask you about how you started to write or how your first book came out, they imagine that it's this fully formed creature that you give birth to, and it's just one big solid object. And that was definitely not the case for me. Part of the reason was, I think, and I get this a lot from when I talk to writers, especially aspiring writers or people who haven't got around to writing yet but want to write, is that I didn't write for a long time because I was busy, with family and freelancing and work, but also the big one, the F word, the fear. I was spending a lot of my life interviewing artists and writers and talking to people about their work and thinking, God, I don't have anything to say, or what could I say that would be interesting, or how would I actually do it? And the strange thing is the essay is a very distinct and kind of forgiving form in that you can try out a lot of things in the essay. You can, funnel a lot of big ideas into it and lots of your own life. And for me, I wasn't interested in writing a memoir. I wanted to write about my life, but lots of other things as well. So I became really interested in the form and started to write individual essays, and they started to get published. Granta published a couple of them, Banshee published one, there was a couple in other books, and slowly they started to come together, and I still didn't think of them as a book because they all seemed quite disparate and different, and not all of them were about the body or about being female or about some of the themes in Constellations. But what happened was that the agency that I'm with now, they run a prize every year. It's a great prize. So it's the Deborah Rogers Prize, and anybody can enter. It's you need to have about 20,000 words. So it's definitely to kind of weed out the people who are very committed and really have a lot of words already stacked up. But it's non-fiction, fiction. You can have a novel, short stories. And I got to the final 8 out of 900. And the agent who I'm with now was at that agency and said, "Well, I'd be interested in taking you on." And I said, "But I don't have a book, and I'm not really sure if I want to write a book." And in fairness to him, he left me alone. He said, "Go off and see what happens," which was the best thing that could have happened, because I already had enough going on in my life that if someone had said, "I want it done in 6 months," I would have ran a mile and hid in a cave, I think. So the idea that he left me alone for a while to see what would come out, how the work would accumulate, was really helpful. And I don't think I could have written the book any other way. So that was the start of it, publishing bits and pieces. And I think it's probably the same. You're a poet yourself, Vivienne, that you accumulate the work by publishing single poems, and then you think down the road about where do I want those pieces to go.
I'm curious about it's a very, very personal book, and I'm just wondering, is it very difficult to put out, to be so personal, to write so personally about your own body and have that then published so it goes out into the world, when it's the beginning part of the book is very, very much about you and your early life and the difficulties you went through.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to that fear question I mentioned earlier, that you do feel like this is very personal. What will people think? And I've said this a couple of times. I have another friend who also has a hip problem like me, different kind though, and she said to me, "God, it's very, you're very public and it's very private, and I literally had a moment of my heart stopping, going, God, what have I done? But I knew that so I was writing about myself, and I was writing about personal things, but I also tried to relate them to other issues. So when I'm writing about, my hip problems, I'm trying to write about what it's like to come of age. It's also about growing up in Ireland. It's also about terrible doctors, and doctors who dismiss women and dismiss female pain and say, you're not sore enough, or you're not in labor, or this isn't possibly happening to you, which happened to me a lot in my experience with men in the medical world. And then when I'm writing about other parts of my body, I'm trying to relate it to the global experience of being an Irish woman. As we know, growing up in Ireland, for all kinds of women, has whether you're someone as privileged as me, or whether you're a disabled woman, or a traveller woman, or a woman of colour, or you're a woman who is subject to the horror of the mother and baby homes or the Magdalen laundries. So I try to bring a lot of those political things and talk about maybe the global female body, not just my body, in these pieces, because I didn't want to write a whole book about just me and my experience, which that wouldn't have interested me at all.
But it is a very positive approach to what was really, really difficult. I think what's interesting is then, having been through the hip difficulty, really, really terrible time in your life, particularly when you're growing up, when you're missing out on friends and school life and that sort of thing, you then are diagnosed with leukemia. I just thought it was a lovely, poignant part of the book when your parents come in and you don't say, you don't talk about your illness, you tell them what you told them.
Do you know, Vivienne, this is the craziest thing. I was already working on this book, and I talked to my mother about that story. So do you remember that night when I didn't want to tell the nurses? My mom's a real worrier, and I didn't. Well, I couldn't look into their face and tell them that I've just got some really terrible news, because at the time, the doctors said, I said, am I going to die? Which I did ask them, and they said, well, you've got a lot of complications and we're going to do our best, is what they said. So they didn't say no. And, they're never going to tell you yes straight out, or no straight out. So I said to the nurse, I don't want to tell my parents. Will you tell my parents? And I knew they were being told, so I was getting myself ready in the bed to see them, and it was just going to be an awful moment. And when my mother appeared around the curtain, I just said, I'm not going to die, I'm going to write a book. And I don't remember saying that. And my mother said, when I was working on the book, she said, do you remember what you said to me that night? And I said, no. I said, I know I was really worried, and I know I needed you to know that I was going to be okay. So I don't know what I said. And she said, you said you were going to write a book and that you weren't going to die, which is staggering to me now. But I talk a lot in the book about illness does weird things to your brain anyway. When you go, and I think trauma is the same, and pain is the same, and whether the experiences are not the same as mine, that your brain sometimes saves you. It creates a sort of a blanking out. It sort of removes things from your mind to kind of keep you a bit safer, and to especially when they're painful or difficult moments. And I think that's what my brain was trying to do me a favor by not recording the full kind of 360 of that really awful moment.
But a great inspiration for anybody going through an illness, or anybody facing that fear of writing a book or attempting to go on that journey.
I think somebody, I was at something, or somebody told me they were at something, where a writer, I wish I could remember who it was, said the best way to get yourself writing is pretend the doctor has told you you've got 6 months to live or something. So that's pretty good at lighting a fire under you, I think. If you think everything is going to come to an end, maybe you'll start writing.
You have a part in the book called Second Mother, and I thought that was particularly poignant because you're writing about Alzheimer's, and about losing somebody before you've lost them. Before you've lost them physically, you're losing them, and how difficult that was for you. You might just talk about that, but we'll make reference to one particular page in a minute.
Sure. I think those teenagers where I was ill, obviously my parents were running around after me a lot, but I have a godmother, Terry. She's one of the people the book is dedicated to. And I say, like, even my other aunties used to say about her, nobody has an auntie like Terry. Like, I think she's that very unique, working class woman who never married and didn't have children of her own. So me and my brothers were her children, particularly me. We were extremely close. And I'm a reader because of all the books she bought me. And we used to go to jumble sales and secondhand bookshops and buy books and exchange books. So she's left a massive imprint on my life for lots of reasons. So then when she was older, and when my kids were small, she lived very close to me, and she used to bring them out all the time. So you get a bit of a break, and she's kind of embedded in every part of my life. And then when we started to notice that this was happening to her, it's very subtle at first, as you know, if you've met, as everybody has met, someone who's had this awful illness, and it is a very cruel illness. That she was so bright, and she was brilliant at crafting and painting and reading, and she was just so good at so many things with her hands, and then to see it all slip away, and all the kind of tricks that people have, which I talk about, as her, she'd stall for time when you'd ask her something because you knew she'd be trying desperately to figure it out. And it's really hard to watch someone at war with their own mind, someone who's really resisting. And I remember her saying that one day, what's happening to me? And it's just that I say it in that piece. I think I probably speak for a lot of people. Like, I think I'd rather be attacked by a shark almost than have my mind go that way. It terrifies all of us because it's that lack of control. And so much of what I talk about in the book is being a patient is about being not in control and not having a sense of that you're calling the shots. And that's what that illness is. That's why it's so horrifying. So it was very hard for us to watch that, because the people, they become a shadow of themselves. And not the person that you remember. And as you say, that's a really good way of putting it. They're gone before they're gone, which was very hard. And particularly my dad, we were all, it was really awful time. But so many families experience it. And I've had a lot of people talk to me about that piece, and about the thing I love about it is a lot of women have talked to me about it who don't have children either, who realise that they're the anti-Terry, which is a lovely kind of connection to make as well.
I just was really, really moved by a piece you wrote on page 230, which perhaps you might read to us. It was just, it's something that says so much to everybody. This idea that, well, better if you read it.
I think it's this paragraph in here. It's right after the bit where she says, sometimes the words, I just can't find them. And that's the thing about dementia. It robs you of your language. Things you would have found commonplace, like asking for a cup of tea, you just can't muster up the sentence structure. And what I thought about that time was, I said, we rarely ask people their stories, the small moments and big joys of their lives, their regrets. We don't until it's too late, until we're sipping whiskey from the wrong size glass at someone's wake. She's still here, and I don't know how to ask, did you ever fall in love? It's too big a question now, too impertinent to pose when her brain struggles with, do you want me to turn the TV down? And that's the thing, it's a reduction in contact, it's a reduction in the interaction you once had, because we talked all the time. I used to visit her all the time, we talked on the phone, and then it's the silences you notice with dementia, that it's so much effort for them to even try and frame a sentence or a conversation or keep up with what's happening. That was the big sadness for me, not hearing her talk as much.
I think that the way you've wrote it, though, Sinead, it's not just, so it's a message to people, not just about Alzheimer's, about trying to talk to people while you still have them. It's trying to talk to everybody while you still have them, particularly a generation above you.
Yeah, I think one of the themes of the book is absolutely about mortality for all of us. That we don't know how long we're here. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if there are illnesses down the road, what kind of illnesses. So, do what you want to do and make time for other people, because that's a common, we all know that stuff. Like, we should have seen people more, we would have talked to people more, told people we love them more. And I think there's lots of reminders and echoes in the book that they're important things to do.
I think just before we I want to move on to talk about the essay, I just think the title, maybe just say something about the title, because it's a beautiful title for a book that is, as you say, about mortality. It's about illness. It's about being out of control, and lots of times about Alzheimer's, about lots of other things. But it's a beautiful title.
Do you know, it was actually just my working title. And I remember saying to Picador when they bought the book, I'm not married to it. If you prefer something else, we can go with that. And they actually really liked it. But I think because it works on a lot of levels, and the idea was, as I mentioned, I wrote the essays as distinct pieces, not knowing I was writing a book. So they were kind of separate to each other. And yet when I started to pull them all together for a book, it became very clear to me that there was a lot more overlap, which I didn't see till quite close to the end, actually. A lot more overlap thematically and in style and language. And that it made perfect sense to me that a constellation, take Orion, for example, there's 12 stars in it, and there's Betelgeuse and different components. So each star is distinct, body all by itself, but it also works in relation to all the other pieces. So that was one of the reasons. I also have a lot of metal in my body from having a lot of surgery, and sometimes think about the idea that they might, glisten under your skin like stars. So it was kind of twofold, but it was very much for me about the format of it, how you can read this book in any order you like, but the pieces are all distinct, but they all are part of the same constellation, if that makes sense.
Yes, it's beautiful. So the essay in general, how important is the essay form as a genre? What can it do? Because it's becoming more and more popular. For a while, you never had books of essays, and now more and more people are producing books of essays, novelists and even poets and so on.
Yeah, very much so. And the thing is, we do actually have a long tradition of the essay in Ireland, going back to, you know, Hubert Butler or Jonathan Swift even. But the last few years, and I've talked about this quite a bit, in that I think, as you know, Vivienne, Ireland has changed socially and culturally an awful lot in the last, particularly 10 years. And a lot of things that you wouldn't have said as freely, it feels like there's room. Conversations have changed, politics have changed, the social kind of outcome of things has changed. And I think there's a lot of things you can say now with the essay. And for me as a form, because I was a journalist for a long time, and I stopped doing print journalism when I started trying to write, because I just found I was putting my words over here when I should have been putting them somewhere else. And you know, journalism is about making an argument and having an opinion, and an essay is, to a certain extent. But for me, I love that the word comes from essayer, which is the French to try. And for me, it's about trying to make sense of how I feel about something. How do I feel about dementia and my Auntie Terry? How do I feel about surgery or terrible doctors or music or motherhood or whatever those things are? So for me, I always think an essay is a way of answering a question. And it's not a straightforward, it's not a flat piece of journalism. It's also doesn't have the distillation and compactness and musicality in some cases that a poem has and demands. But for me, it helps me figure out how I feel about something. And the way you do that is you splice what it is you want to say, so what your subject object theme is, and you meld language around that. And I think language is a very key part of it. Otherwise you're veering too much toward the academic if you don't make it lyrical, if you don't make it into a new kind of writing. So as a form, I'd say it's almost the most malleable. I say the word bendy about it a lot, even more so than the short story has a lot of rules. A novel can be very big and baggy and digressive, and a poem is really hard to do. But I think the essays kind of take some of those forms, some of those rules, and sort of both upends them and upholds them. But I like it a lot as a form. Also, you can write an essay in a page, or you can write 15,000 word essays. So they're, in terms of form, I think they afford experimentation in a way maybe other forms don't so much.
Well, that leads perfectly on to the next question. Because we talked before this about, you said denied being a poet, though I would definitely refute that. Because you've got two sections in Constellations where on the page, in terms of form, it looks like poetry, you know, it looks like verse. But you described the one, I'm going to argue about the second bit, the non-letter to my daughter in a minute, but you talked about the other section being sort of like micro essays. And that's a really interesting, you know, because you were saying it's kind of like a flexi form. Can you talk about that whole brilliant way that language can be manipulated to being one thing and another and everything?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what it comes down to is that I don't think of myself as a poet purely because there's too many way better poets than me, and people that I know who literally will spend 2 weeks on one word. And I'd love to tell you I've done that, but I haven't in many cases. Some essays have taken a long time, but I feel I'm not the, you know, the Heaney-esque digging with my pen. I just feel I'm not the person who has the ability to do that. Often the work will, you know, appear on the page and it's more about thought processes, and it's more about what I'm trying to say, whereas I think with poetry it's more about the language. And I think if that kind of economy and musicality that you get with poetry is much more the terrain of the poets. It's a funny one. It's not that I'm actually holding poets up above me and saying that I'm definitely not as good a poet as the poets I like and revere. So I feel a bit impostery saying that I'm a poet, because it's a very difficult, of all the forms, I think poetry is the hardest, which is why I feel that it's not my best domain, even though I do love it. And I have a bit more, like, I don't have fear about writing essay or fiction, but I have a terror of writing poems. Like, it won't be good enough, it'll be terrible, who'll want to read it, you know? It's just, I get that all the time. And I think there's a huge level of skill and craft required in poetry that there's a reason why most novelists are not poets, or most short story writers are not poets, because it's really hard to do. And that would be kind of my feeling about it. And yet it's funny, I'll probably contradict myself by saying that it takes a long time to write a poem, and yet some people say to me that the non-letter to my daughter, which is the closing piece in the book about my daughter, that was written in about 20 minutes one afternoon when my daughter came home from school and we were having a conversation. And it just was, I was really just fired up and upset and wanted to say something about it and wanted to say something to her. So I thought I'll say it on the page. And I think maybe, again, we're used to, like a lot of poetry, isn't it? You can do, the rules of poetry have changed so much. I mean, I know this from reading a lot more contemporary stuff recently, that it isn't all about meter and rhyme, and it isn't all about very strict rules. But I also, poetry, it's kind of like falling in love. You know a good poem when you see it. You can't describe what it is. You don't know why it's good, but you know it's good. And I think it's that elusiveness and strangeness that you can't pin it down is where why I like the magic of it, and why I'm also so terrified of it.
Okay, I mean, I think a non-letter to my daughter certainly is a really, really beautiful poem. Would you like just to read the last, I think just the ending of it, maybe the last 4 verses?
Sure.
Because it's just, it's a really positive, I mean, it says non-letter to my daughter, but it's a really, really, it's almost like a guidebook for growing up. And with a kind of love and protection layer with it. But at the same time saying, go and be yourself.
Absolutely. And that was, I think, kind of the point of it. And because it was such a quick thing, sometimes I think when something's written quickly, it doesn't have that, it won't have a depth or an endurance. And yet this is the thing that I've always used to get asked to read at festivals, and there was always people crying afterwards at the end. So it's sometimes work surprises you. And this is one of the pieces that surprised me in terms of the impact that it had. Weigh the world up like a bag of water. Try to guess the weight of the life you want. Your peacock swoon and tiger spine. Oh, your sea glass eyes. Don't be afraid. Don't be fearful. They are not the same thing. Don't worry about what will happen next. Assume there is goodness all around, unless there is not. And even then, be the goodness.
It's really, really beautiful. I can see how people would cry at hearing the whole poem being read. So in terms of poetry, Sinead, you said, I think obviously a lot of your language in Constellations and in your short stories is very poetical. So I just wondering whether you have, a favorite poet or poems that you refer to. Very often people, I think during the time of COVID in particular, people kind of learn poems off by heart or have favorite poems they return to kind of for comfort and escape.
Absolutely. And the thing is, I've always been a poetry reader. I still devour it, even if I'm not turning so much of it up on the page myself. And I think a lot of conversations I've had over the last year, people are frazzled and tired and feeling morose, feeling hopeless, and nothing provides the kind of hope that a poem does. Also, I think the idea that it's something small that can be ingested, and that's not to say that anything that's small and fragmented is immediately tiny or to be kind of gobbled up and digested quickly. That's not what I mean at all. But I've been steering people towards poems. So in terms of, I think there's a lot of incredible Irish poets. I love Elaine Feeney's poetry. Her collection Rise is brilliant. Jessica Trainor's The Quick is unreal. Erin Fornoff, there's a lot of people writing incredible work here. I quoted a couple of poets at the start of Constellations in the epigraphs. I love Liz Berry. She has an incredible collection called The Republic of Motherhood, which is I stood beneath the flag of motherhood even though I didn't know the anthem. I love it. And then Ocean Vuong, who's, again, interestingly, a poet whose last book was a novel. His book Night Sky with Exit Wounds is one of my favourite collections. Dana Smith, the American writer, Maggie Smith, so many, just a ton of people. It's always one of those things you're put on the spot. But I think it's a lot of people I know who haven't ever been committed poetry readers or have not really considered themselves a fan necessarily, have been reading a lot more of it over the last year. I think it's the framework of it, the smallness of it, and the sheer kind of distillation of what's said on a page in a poem is what people are kind of really gravitating towards in the last year, which is a really good thing,
And perhaps learning poetry by heart, because somehow, if you're anxious and if you can't sleep, I do, if I say off a poem that I've learned by heart, and it kind of the rhythm or the sound of the words, next minute you realize you're asleep.
Yeah, that's
one of my favorite poems for that reason is The Listeners, Walter Delamere, The Listeners. And if you start that off, it's so beautiful and musical that you're gone.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it makes sense because poetry is quite incantatory. It's kind of like a mantra, and mantras are the things. The lockdown will end. We will get better. We will get over this. They're all the things. I mean, we're all trying to remind ourselves every day that it won't be like this forever. And poetry has such a lot of recurrence and sort of repetition and the idea of hammering home a theme, an idea which you can do in a handful of lines,
Yeah.
is kind of alchemy in a way. And I think that's why a
Yes.
lot of us are reading it.
Another, just keeping on the other theme of books, I'm always interested in what writers read. So I'm always interested now, what are you reading? What are you reading? Do you have, and what influences you? Have you had writers that have been a big influence in your life? And obviously not necessarily poets, but any kind of writer. And would you go back and reread them again and again?
I think I often horrify people by saying I'm not a rereader, and then I realize that I do sometimes, especially for research. I'm writing a piece at the moment about Brazil and Clarice Lispector, so I've been rereading Clarice Lispector's short stories, and what were called her chronicas. They were these kind of pieces she wrote for newspapers, and it's funny when you read things at different points in your life. Like Virginia Woolf was somebody I did my seminar in college on Woolf, and Woolf has kind of stayed with me all through my life. Even when you get, at the time you're sort of wide-eyed, and then you get older and realize, she's an extremely privileged white lady who has some very questionable political views. So you go back and reassess how you feel about the writer when it really is about the words on the page. But Woolf is someone I have gone back to, particularly to The Lighthouse quite a bit. I have a lighthouse obsession, and she's somebody who's just consistent. And I think sometimes with contemporary reading, we're getting bombarded with new books all the time, and some things will endure and some things won't. But yeah, I'm not a rereader generally, because I have that panicky feeling if there are thousands of books, I'm never going to get to them all, and I get sent a lot of things to blurb and to read. So I kind of always have a stack of things on the go. But I think that it's funny when I think about the essay as well. Nobody was really doing it in Ireland when I was starting to. The first one was published in 2015, and it was American writers who were showing that you could write this really lyrical nonfiction that wasn't necessarily just about yourself. So people like Roxane Gay or Maggie Nelson, Leslie Jemison, even going back to Audre Lorde's writing, the Cancer Diaries from the 70s is incredible. A Black queer woman writing about her experience of being ill was just blew my mind. So we're always, everybody knows you can't be a writer without being a reader, and anybody who says they don't read much as a writer is, well, probably not a very good writer. So we always have our foremothers and forefathers and the people who sort of light the path ahead for us. And so you have to keep reading. I've many times I've interviewed writers. I remember I interviewed Martin Amis once, and he said, I don't read anybody who's not dead, which kind of alarmed me and made me sad, because I'm thinking, the things you're missing out on, So you have to keep your game up, and you have to keep in touch with what's going on. There's nothing wrong with going back to the classics, but it's important to do a bit of both, I think.
I'm just fascinated by the Virginia Woolf story, because I didn't study Virginia Woolf in university and just came to her afterwards. And I have a shrine. If I would dare turn my camera, I could show it to you, but I don't dare turn the camera. I was shrine to her of all her letters, diaries, everything.
Wow. Yeah, the
mad
letters are brilliant. And the essays are brilliant. Like Street
they're
Hawk
brilliant.
is one I teach a lot about, the idea of going for a walk in London and being a kind of a flanneuse, if you like. But she's super. The non-fiction is just as good as the novels to me, and the letters too.
Absolutely. Now we move on to your next bit of writing. So your innovative writing, as I said at the beginning, because you have been described as the champion of other writers, and you were a champion of other writers long before you actually became a writer yourself, in with Constellations or with short stories. And so you've edited 4 anthologies. The latest one is a beautiful book, which I hope people can see behind me.
I'm loving the product placement behind you there. Yeah. Very well done. Thank you so much.
No, it's a really beautiful book. It's because it's really, part of being beautiful, it's also really easy to read, because it stays open when you're reading it, unlike some books where you have to kind of pin them open. But you that's not how you start. What brought you to anthologies, and why are they so important?
A funny thing is, another writer brought me to anthologies. I got an email out of the blue one day from Anne Enright, who I didn't know at the time. I had interviewed her once, and I had been on the TV the night before reviewing a novel of hers on the View TV show. And she said, I've been asked to edit an anthology, and I don't have the time to do it, but I was thinking, who knows about books and who might be interested in this? And you were on the telly last night, and your name sprang from my lips when I was asked. So I didn't have any qualifications other than being somebody who read a lot and was, a reader and would be interested in the form. So I agreed to take on this first anthology, and I suppose I got a bit of a bug for it. I got quite interested in it, and it was only then, probably when I came to The Long Gaze Back, that I started to realize what anthologies can do in terms of omission and what is canon, who gets included in the canon, who gets included in every anthology, who doesn't, what kinds of writers, what kind of work. So for me, they were often acts of reclamation and resurrection, that you can find people within them who have just slipped through the cracks. And it happens to people for a variety of reasons, geography or money or having families or, illness or whatever it is. And it's happened with every anthology I've done since then. I've tried to find people, to bring people back to sort of, acts of redivivus, nearly bring Christ, like bringing people back to life. And I think it's really important because there's so much work that we don't get to see because of who selects what goes into certain books. And for a long time, I talked about this, that a lot of the anthologists were male. They tended to pick more men, same kind of work, when they could have made space for other people. So I was interested. So you can do a couple of things with it. You can resurrect work. You can broaden the canvas of who gets to have a voice, and you can showcase different kinds of work. And whether that's you want to include more ghost stories or a genre or whatever. So each step along, it has to be doing something different each anthology. I might take a little break from it now because I'd love to see what somebody else would do with an Irish anthology, not just me.
I think you mentioned, I heard you in another interview mentioning how writers are rediscovered, by doing the anthologies, and particularly a writer like Nora Holt. Now, I didn't know anything about Nora Holt until I read, until you resurrected her or brought her to life again. I mean, that's a very important part of life, of a writer's life, isn't it? Or of for another writer. To do that for another writer is really special.
I think it's really important. And in Nora Holt's case, I also point out that I'm not the only person who has anthologized or edited female anthologies. Lots of brilliant people have done it before me. Alva Smith and Caroline Walsh when she was in the Irish Times, but particularly the brilliant Evelyn Conlon, who's in who's in all three of the last anthologies. Evelyn published a book in 2001 called Cutting the Night in Two, which was 34 short stories, all women, which I had never seen because every anthology I'd really encountered before that was mostly men, and just the same handful of women, Somerville and Ross, Edna O'Brien, Mary Lavin, all brilliant, but the same people coming up all the time. So Evelyn was the person who included Nora Holt's story in that book, and I started looking and wondering who she was, and Evelyn said the stuff is really hard to find. She only died in 1984. There are 26 books, 22 novels, 4 short story collections. A lot of them are really hard to find. Even in the National Library, they don't have all of them. So a lot of digging is required. I refer to it as literary archaeology, because you often find, with some cases, some writers I've gone in and there's 4 copies of 4 different books, and you go in and they're not there, or they're not the right kind of book, or they don't have the short story you want. So there's a lot of wild goose chases and a lot of near misses. But in Nora's case, one thing I love is that she appeared in the collection, and then Louise Kennedy, who has a wonderful short story collection coming out in April with Bloomsbury, and has been shortlisted for the Sunday Times Prize a couple of times. She's a superb writer. Louise found Nora in the long days back. She'd never heard of her either, and was looking for a PhD to do in Queen's, and her PhD is half creative and half critical, and the critical is on Nora. So and since then, so New Island had, with such a response to that story, New Island republished Cocktail Bar, the collection that it's from, that I wrote the introduction, and then they published another novel, and I asked them to get Louise to write the introduction. So these 2 new books are in the world because of one story being in anthology. So that to me is the power of anthologies. They can bring a writer back from the dead, literally, and bring them to more readers. And that's really important because there's thousands more. I've discovered lots, but there's probably lots of people I don't even know about. And I also say that if it wasn't for academia, the academics doing all of this amazing work week in, week out, lots of them have been so helpful in terms of what I've been trying to do with these collections. So they're keeping a lot of these writers alive, even if they're not necessarily in print.
It's great. Yeah, it's wonderful. Wonderful. I know that a lot of people listening will be writers themselves. And I know people always ask of a writer, what is your craft, or how do you go about writing? Do you have a routine, a special place?
At the moment, it's holed up where I am now. I actually bought a tiny desk during the lockdown because there was nowhere else in the house with kids and everybody else here. So I'm sort of a person, I can write anywhere. I can write on the train. I love writing on planes and stuff like that. So I'm good at tuning out the white noise. I don't need to have a little sort of ritual, but I notice that it's like exercise. If I get out of the habit of it, you start to get a bit slack about it. So I have to try and make myself do it every day. And I think that was another reason for not. It took me a long time to get to writing. I'd have bursts. I'd do a big week or two and think, right, this is it. I'm on the way now with the writing. And then I just stop. because things got in the way, and you kind of have to show up all the time. So for me, I try and do it in the morning. I try and do it as early as I can. A lot of Constellations was written by getting up at 5 or 6 o'clock because there was no other time. I'm useless in the evening. I can't string a word together on the page by then. Some people are night owls. I'm not, especially with creativity. So and once it's done, then before the world crowds in and before everybody's looking for you to collect people from school or do whatever it is you need to do or do your other work, it's done. So, and I think there's something about the morning when no one's bothering you and it's quiet and often dark. There's something a little bit magical about writing at that time. So I don't believe in daily word counts, but I do believe in doing a bit every day. So do what you can. And again, a couple of paragraphs a day adds up in no time. And it does become an active accumulation. So I try not to, it's funny, I'm working on a novel and it's been written a different way to Constellations. Constellations, I kind of stopped and researched and stopped because there's a lot of information in Constellations around, science and language and history. So I'd stop and start. But with the novel, I think, and I remember being in Anna McCarrick once, and the wonderful Mary Dorsey, who's a fantastic poet and writer. I was telling her that I was writing like this, and she was horrified. And she said, "Oh God, you shouldn't write like that." And she left me a copy of her poems outside my door the next morning. She was leaving early, and she wrote on the inside, "Write with the handbrake off," which I really liked. And I think that's how I'm approaching the fiction. I think I think it's fatal maybe with some processes, particularly like a novel, to stop and start. And so I think you have to try and get all the way to the end, and then you can look back through your fingers in horror and start to fix it and draft it and re-edit. But for essays, they're different. They're a bit more analytical, so you can stop and research and come back. And with essays, you can also, when one's not going well, you can sneak off and work on another one and then come back to it. So that's also really handy.
And I suppose in terms of writing and living, we have to mention the pandemic we're all living through. Has that affected? I've talked to some writers who say they just literally could not write during the first lockdown, and anxiety had taken over, so they were literally unable to put words on paper. So has COVID affected you positively, negatively?
A bit of both. I mean, I think a lot of writers will say, like, obviously things like income and travel, and where a lot of us would be going away to do events or travel or teach. I had a lot of stuff lined up, but nobody I know was sick, and we've all been well. So there's ups and downs. Weirdly, yeah, I find some things are taking me a lot longer. I have 2 essays in it that are due in, and they've both taken a lot longer than they should. Just the concentration is not what it was. And yet, when my children went back to school in September after being home for months, I went, okay, this might happen again, so I better get down to it. So I chugged away at I'd been working on the novel for a long time anyway, and I managed to finish a draft. I was putting like 12, 15-hour days when I could, like deliriously so. But I was really afraid that we'd be back where we are, and we are. So I was very, your time becomes a very precious commodity when all your usual routines and everybody else's routines that impact on yours are all upended. But yeah, I've also weirdly kind of have another little thing that might be nothing, that's in a notebook that's only on paper, purely to stop me being online or looking at the news, because I found all that quite overwhelming. It can be very full on in quite catastrophic, and sometimes it's quite hopeless looking at the news. So, and I think that's also an enemy of creativity, too much of onlineness and too much news. So I've been trying to stay off it, and so it's weird for me to have something that just exists in a book. Everything I've ever written is always on a screen, purely because I'm time poor and it's easier to just get it right on there than having to write it and then transcribe it. So I like that this little book is only written by hand in a book. So because I don't know that, then I don't know the word count or the shape of it or how long it is, and I haven't edited or backspaced the way we will on a computer. So I like that it's its own separate piece of writing, even from the kind of the creation of it has been not like anything else before. So
that's not the draft of the novel.
No, it's another kind of it's a non-fiction thing. I'm not sure what it is. It might never show it to anyone. But for now, yeah.
Sorry, but normally you write on a screen. Do you keep notebooks and carry them around with you?
Oh yeah, always. Yeah, I always have notebooks, and I'm always typing notes up into my phone. Even like I often get RSI in one of my writing arm, so I have turn the mic on the phone and talk into it sometimes. But yeah, no, I'm always, because I'm also terrible. Maybe it's the same for other people, but if I don't write something down at the time, I'll forget it. I never remember things, so I'm always have a notebook in the bag, or always tapping into the notes app on my phone. But just for expedience, I tend to type on the computer, and I do think that does something else. As I say, to the work, you're more likely to cut, paste, backspace, as opposed to just letting that write with the handbrake off, which I think you do by hand. And with hand, you have to think about it's a brain hand coordination thing. You have to think about the word, you think about the selection. Whereas on the computer, you're more likely you'll type and go, nah, and backspace, and you might do that a couple of times. So you're already editing once you're on a computer. So maybe that's why this weird little notebook has come out of nowhere. Maybe it's what my brain needs at the moment.
And just in terms of fiction, Sinead, you know, having moved from, well, the essay, poetry, short stories, what inspired the novel?
Do you know that the novel it's a very specific idea that I've had since before Constellations. The epilogue of it I have not changed, and I think it's about 10 years old. And it's one of those things that it's like a rabid dog getting hold of you, that like it won't let me go, and I have not been able to shake it off, and I've tried other things, and this thing won't let go of me. So it's set in a very specific place, and there's a very specific phenomenon that happens in this place. So it's quite atmospheric and very much rooted in the land, and a bit kind of folkloric, and and I again, like that too, I had the main character, I gave her a name which was only ever going to be like, you know, a placeholder name, and now I can't imagine calling her anything else, and I wish I thought of a different name, but now I like the name, it suits her, it's absolutely who she is. But yeah, I absolutely, they come from different places. It's much more, fiction is a strange, it's an active imagination, whereas with the non-fiction you are drawing it heavily on experience or fact or things that happened in real life, your life history, whatever it is. Whereas fiction, you can, the freedom that comes with being able to make everything up is quite liberating, and yet this, you know, has its own challenges. It's different parts of it that I like more than others. But yeah, it's there a long time, so the creaky draft is finished. That's what I'm about to go back to when I finish these other deadlines. So yeah. I think that's good though. The drawer is good. They always say that. A lot of writers say that, you know, it's good to put something away. I haven't looked at it since November, so I think I'm ready to go back into it now and see all the horrifying things that are wrong with it and fix them.
And when you say, did you write the novel with the handbrake off, and that's why it's now went into the drawer, and then you go back and...
Yeah, a lot of it was that way, and also weirdly, because I was writing it over the last few years when I was trying to write Constellations, and I was doing a lot of things for Constellations, I didn't have much time. So a lot of it, and I did a lot of travel, so a lot of it was written in scenes and fragments. So by the time I didn't have a chapter 1, chapter 2, I had all these bits. So it was a question of like writing horizontally, I think maybe I'd call it. So it was a question of like, okay, I know I can't fix that bit there, but I know this is going to happen later on, or this is going to happen earlier. So I kind of wrote in all these very unproductive, probably terrible way of writing, but that's how it worked for me. When I had a moment and I'd write a scene, and I go, okay, that can be for later. I'll come back to this. So yeah, all over the place really. But as many people will say, otherwise, if I had sat down, I'm not going to go on to chapter 2 until I finish chapter 1, I wouldn't have written anything, and you can't edit a blank page. So at least I had the words. I had some words. They might be in the right order, but I figured I had to trust myself that I could figure it all out at the end, which I did.
And can I ask you, is it written from first person or third person? Just as a matter of interest?
No, it's not, and that's actually quite tricky. I think it'd be much easier if I'd written in first person, but I didn't want to write it in first person. Also because the voice just sounded, it's close third, and there are other kind of voices in it as well, of other things, and that not necessarily people. So it had to be a close third. I think you could do a lot with close third as well that you can't with first. And also, you know, I just written a non-fiction first person book, so it didn't really interest me. But yeah, first is definitely quicker and easier, but I think there's a lot more mystery and a lot more nuance involved in close third. And I have always, the books I like, it's funny, it's actually staggering. You start to look at how many novels are first person. It's most, if a lot of the things I've been reading. So it's harder to do, but I think it's worth the effort. I like, personally, I've always liked close third as an authorial voice. You can do
because there are a lot of auto fiction novels that are come out recently, and which are not necessarily a bad thing. It's just sometimes, and I wondered, having, you know, written the very, very personal essays, what it would be like then to write. I would imagine it's much better to jump to the close third than to be in the first person, in case people got confused and said, "Oh, this is Sinead again," you know.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's an interesting thing, especially as the woman in this character is she has lots of questionable habits, let's just say, which are definitely not my life. But I think it's also something that happens to women. I've seen this conversation a lot, that when women write from their own experience, it's like when Sally Rooney was on the radio once and was asked had she had an affair with a married man after writing Conversations with Friends. I think there's an immediate assumption that women lack weirdly, women apparently lack some narrative impulse towards making things up, and that anything that a man writes, even when it's very clearly closely related to his own life, is complete fiction. So I think that's again a charge that's leveled at women a lot more, that autobiography is a bigger part of their fiction than is laid at the door of men. And that's unfortunate. That's also sexism, and it's also a part of publishing and writing that we're all used to, but it's changing, hopefully.
Hopefully. Sinead, it's been really, really an absolute pleasure talking to you. We're going to end with you reading again. It's a reading from your short story called The Lexicon of Babies, which is published in Being Various, New Irish Short Stories, edited by Lucy Caldwell. But I just, maybe before you read from it, because I think we have a little bit of time, before you read from it and before we disappear, it's a very unusual story. And it's brilliant. So maybe we need to hear just the inspiration, and then you could perhaps do the reading. But just I'll be phasing out just to say thank you very much. It's lovely. I wish we could have met in person and chatted for ages more in each other's studies, perhaps.
I wish we were in Limerick and we'd been at a lovely event with an audience and gone for a glass of wine afterwards, Vivienne, which we will do at some point in the future. And thank you for those wonderful questions and the beautiful event. It's been lovely. I wish you all the best with the rest of the festival.
Thank you.
This story, I almost laugh when I talk about this story because it is such a strange, weird one. Lucy Caldwell, who's the editor of this wonderful book, asked me for a short story, and it was in the middle of trying to finish Constellations and also the Repeal, the eighth campaign was in full flow in Ireland, and I was doing canvassing and doing a lot of different things. So my brain, to put it mildly, was absolutely fried and frazzled. And I think a lot of people said, particularly the last few weeks of that campaign, every woman I know was rattled and upset and terrified that the outcome wouldn't be the one that we were all campaigning for. So this is the story that came out of this, which is it's a lot to do with that. And I think it sort of ties in weirdly with a lot of what was going on in Constellations. So it's called The Lexicon of Babies. The palimpsest council was outraged. There was spluttering and shouting and much stamping of feet because they knew, of course, that they might be the last generation to have actual feet. There was no mistaking that this was an incendiary turn of events. The council had only been in existence for 2 years, but had attempted to preside fairly over all the changes in this new world. Everything had been so singular up until then, but now every birth was like buying a pack of football stickers and tearing open the wrapper. Still, each set of parents was coochie-cooed in the bliss of their own progeny, whatever it turned out to be. From the eel-slick birth to the big reveal, they were heart-skip happy. Mostly, anyway. No one knows how it started, how the country's howling babes, all soft folds and blue eyes, were replaced by letters, actual letters, letters. Fonts instead of fontanelles. What were once pudgy, obstreperous infants now came into the world as life-size letters. Instead of having a boy, girl, or non-binary infant, women were giving birth to the alphabet, or the lexicon babies, as the palimpsest council called them. The first case was reported in Clough Jordan, Tipperary, then Inishtig, Skahina Rinky, Balnafad, Ringaskiddy, and a cluster of births in the Burren. One woman had twins close to the Irish border and was in all the papers because of one of the babies was a U, causing a resurgence in headline puns and sectarian tension. There was conflict about the Irish language alphabet, which was fewer letters than its English counterpart. Gaeilgeoirs up in arms as the shadow of colonialism rose up like a famine ghost. Some of the mothers bragged about the number of stitches they had. Well, mine was W, so you can imagine. D was huge, tore me to pieces, but it was worth it. Their partners stayed quiet and remembered how much they were shouted at in the delivery ward. The robust physiognomy of the new letter babies meant they could eat from birth and did not require milk. Breastfeeding became a thing of the past, an old ritual like burning sage or using a payphone. There was a monument to cabbage leaves in the old part of the town. Breast pumps dumped at the doors of museums. On school tours in later years, children passed them in glass cases and assumed that they were once used as torture devices in wars. Everyone wanted X, Q, and Z babies. Their size, their complicated shape, was a physical declaration that the mothers had suffered, a demonstrative martyrdom. Vowel babies were not so in demand. There were more of them, and they were considered common. Coupled with the ease of their births, they became a source of derision for the mothers of consonants. Some things, of course, stayed the same. The women competed in the way that new mothers do, in the desperation of their virtuousness and the projected high achievements of their offspring. M babies, all angular hairline pins, were excellent dancers and were duly enrolled in ballet and experimental tap classes. L babies were naturally suited to yoga. The babies at the latter end of the alphabet were more cerebral, no one knew why, and were often found in the library munching on the corners of large print books. The Y babies had a talent for music, thanks to their forked limbs. Some played instruments, though drums were particularly popular, necessitating the purchase of expensive ear protectors. The babies also had a penchant for hip-hop, Curtis Blow, Wu-Tang Clan, Missy Elliott. Here are some more things about the babies. They could walk from birth, standing up like jelly-legged antelopes in the hospital. They tired easily, though, and still required lordly transportation in buggies. Some of the babies had top-of-the-range prams, souped-up fancy models in titanium and neon shades that were only slightly smaller than motorbikes. Most people could not justify the expense, but parents of M and W, the white babies, had no choice. I and A parents, aware of the stigma around vowels, of how they were looked down on for their ordinariness and frequency, knew that their offspring would have a harder time. Vowel parents deemed college attendance essential if they were to have any kind of life. They carted their babies around in boxes from supermarkets, saving on pram expenses they could put towards college fees. That was on the assumption that college fees, or indeed college, would still exist when the babies were of an age to go. The less favoured letters simply had to work harder in a world that preferred their elite alphabetical peers. The discrimination was meted out in small, icy moments. In garden centres and coffee shop queues, everything was changing, but the unspoken consensus among adults was that it was important to carry on as before. The babies had no pronouns, not in the spirit of modernity or fluidity mind, but because the English alphabet had no gender, and the council was glad of small mercies amid the crisis. There was no reason to dress babies in pink or blue now, but these tiny dervishes were inveterate consumers, their mothers attuned to sartorial trends. This season's colour was taupe, so all the babies looked naked from a distance, or if they were wearing some weird kind of extra layer of baby skin. Of course, the babies still had hearts and lungs. Each one still shat like a cannon, cried from hunger or tiredness, or when bulbs of tiny teeth sprouted in its mouth.